was she dangerous?
Because of the need for her to rehabilitate her image.
That made her dangerous?
That made her dangerous because of the connections that she was forging within the British press.
On Christmas morning 2025, while most of Britain was still wrapped in the calm rituals of family breakfasts and quiet traditions, a crisis was already unfolding behind the walls of Buckingham Palace. What should have been a day of unity for the royal family turned into one of the most destabilizing moments the monarchy had faced in years. Private emails, never meant to exist beyond a trusted circle, had surfaced. And once palace officials realized what those messages contained, it became clear this wasn't just a leak, it was a fracture. The danger wasn't scandal in the traditional sense. There were no explicit insults, no explosive accusations, no language that could be easily dismissed as rage or bitterness. What made the situation so volatile was something far more unsettling. The emails revealed vulnerability, insecurity, jealousy that had been carefully hidden behind years of controlled appearances. In an institution built on silence and restraint, that kind of emotional exposure was radioactive. To understand why these messages carried such destructive power, you have to rewind to the moment the balance inside the royal family quietly began to shift. In early 2024, Catherine, Princess of Wales, stepped away from public duties to focus on her health. The absence was medically necessary, but what followed surprised even seasoned palace strategists. Instead of moving on, the public waited. Sympathy poured in from across Britain, the United States, and beyond. Letters flooded palace offices. Social media filled with messages of concern and encouragement. Catherine had become something more than a senior royal. She became the emotional center of the monarchy. For Queen Camilla, this moment was deeply unsettling. Her journey had been the opposite of effortless. Decades earlier, public opinion had been openly hostile. Acceptance came slowly, earned through discipline, consistency, and years of careful rehabilitation. She built initiatives. She showed up without complaint. She stood beside the king through storms that would have broken most people. Yet none of that generated the instinctive affection Catherine inspired simply by existing, and that contrast cut deeper than Camilla. Ever admitted publicly as Catherine's recovery continued through the spring and summer, the divide became more visible. Each carefully timed appearance Catherine made was met with overwhelming enthusiasm. Crowds reacted with relief, not curiosity. Cameras followed her every move. Meanwhile, Camilla's engagements, planned months in advance, were quietly overshadowed. Articles mentioned her briefly, often in the same breath as speculation about when Catherine might return next. It wasn't that Camilla was ignored, it was that she was eclipsed. Those close to Camilla began to notice subtle changes, frustration after events, sharp comments that slipped out when guards were down, a growing reliance on a small circle of confidants who offered empathy rather than caution. One of them, Lady Henrietta Ashford, became the recipient of Camilla's most private thoughts. What began as occasional venting slowly turned into written correspondence, and once words were committed to email, they stopped being fleeting emotions and became permanent records. The messages themselves evolved over time. Early emails reflected exhaustion and concern about how the palace narrative was being managed. Later, ones hinted at suspicion, questions about timing, about whether Catherine's appearances were unintentionally, or perhaps strategically, overshadowing Camilla's work. Nothing was stated outright, but implication hung heavily between the lines. By late 2025, the emails revealed something far more personal. A fear that history would remember Camilla as temporary. That no matter how hard she worked, she would always be compared to someone who seemed to command love without effort. What Camilla didn't know was that the space she believed was safe no longer was. Reports later claimed that Lady Henrietta had been struggling financially, carrying debts that created vulnerability. According to investigators, someone recognized the explosive potential of those emails and quietly began archiving them. Whether Henrietta acted knowingly or was compromised remains officially unresolved. But what is clear is that the correspondence left Camilla's control long before Christmas morning arrived. When the emails landed in the hands of senior palace staff, the response was immediate and severe. Digital forensics confirmed their authenticity within hours. Encryption, metadata, writing style, all matched. This wasn't fabrication. And worse, word began spreading that journalists had been tipped off. The leak had been designed to corner the palace, forcing reaction instead of preparation. Timing wasn't accidental. Christmas, with cameras fixed on Unity at Sandringhouse, ensured maximum emotional impact. Catherine learned about the emails privately, moments before stepping into public view. The betrayal didn't come with shouting or confrontation. It came quietly, through carefully chosen words, delivered by a husband trying to shield her from pain he couldn't prevent. The hurt wasn't anger, it was shock. The realization that actions she took to protect her health and her children had been interpreted as calculated ambition, that someone she treated with respect had been privately questioning her motives. What followed became one of the most defining moments of Catherine's public life. She chose silence. No statements, no rebuttals, no leaks of her own. She walked to church, smiling, waved to crowds, and stood exactly where protocol required her to stand. That restraint did more than any defense ever could. In contrast to exposed insecurity, composure looked like strength. Behind closed doors, the palace faced an impossible choice: defend Camilla and risk appearing to excuse the sentiments, deny the emails and lose credibility, or acknowledge the breach and quietly restructure power. In the end, the monarchy chose containment. No public shaming, no dramatic announcements. Instead, Camilla's influence was narrowed. Her circle of advisors reshuffled, her schedule adjusted, her independence reduced. The title remained, but the leverage did not. Public reaction filled the silence Catherine left behind. Support surged, particularly in the United States, where audiences who had followed her health journey felt personally protective. In Britain, older generations saw echoes of history repeating itself. Younger viewers showed more nuance, but even then, the consensus was clear. Catherine had done nothing wrong, and the emails revealed far more about Camilla's fears than about Catherine's character. In the end, the most damaging truth wasn't written in any message. It was revealed through contrast. One woman expressed her resentment in private, believing no one would ever see it. The other absorbed betrayal and responded with dignity. In an institution where trust is the only real currency, silence spoke louder than words, and the monarchy learned, once again, that the most dangerous thing isn't scandal. It's honesty without restraint. As the days after Christmas unfolded, the consequences of the leak began surfacing in quieter but far more permanent ways. There were no dramatic press conferences, no public confrontations, no royal statements dripping with emotion. Instead, the monarchy responded the way it always has, when survival matters more than spectacle, slowly, strategically, and almost invisibly to anyone not paying close. Attention inside palace walls. Trust had become the rarest commodity. Every private conversation was re-examined. Every advisor reassessed. Security protocols that hadn't been meaningfully updated in years were suddenly rewritten overnight. Personal laptops were flagged as liabilities. Informal confidants were no longer viewed as emotional support, but as potential exposure points. The leak had done what years of warnings could not. It forced the institution to admit that its greatest vulnerabilities weren't external threats, but internal looseness. Prince William's role shifted noticeably in the weeks that followed. Those close to him described a man no longer willing to rely on tradition alone to protect his family. His patience for ambiguity vanished. His insistence on airtight boundaries around Catherine intensified. Meetings that once felt ceremonial became sharply focused. Conversations that had once been diplomatic grew firm. The message was clear without ever being spoken aloud. Catherine would never again be left unshielded. For Camilla, the isolation was subtle but unmistakable. Invitations, she once expected, stopped arriving. Briefings grew shorter. Decisions that had previously involved her input were finalized elsewhere. Her public schedule thinned, not abruptly, but steadily, as if the palace were gently lowering the volume rather than switching off the sound entirely. No announcement explained the shift, but palace watchers noticed immediately. Influence was being removed without humiliation, which made it impossible to protest without appearing defensive. What made the situation particularly painful was that Camilla herself never publicly lashed out. She issued no counter-narrative. She did not claim misinterpretation or context. That silence, however, wasn't strategic strength. It was containment. The palace had decided that the best way to neutralize the damage wasn't denial, but distance. The fewer words spoken, the faster the story would lose oxygen. Catherine, meanwhile, continued exactly as before. If anything, her presence grew steadier. Engagements were calm, focused, deliberate. She spoke about causes, not controversy. She smiled without overcompensation. She avoided even accidental references to tension. The public noticed. Commentators began pointing out that she appeared not hardened by betrayal, but clarified by it. Where others might have withdrawn, she leaned quietly forward. The British press, famously ruthless, found itself unexpectedly restrained. Editors understood the optics. Attacking Catherine now would backfire. Attacking Camilla further risked appearing cruel. Instead, coverage softened into analysis rather than accusation. The narrative shifted from scandal to consequence, from who leaked the emails to what they revealed about power, insecurity, and succession. Across the Atlantic, the reaction was sharper. American outlets framed the situation less as royal drama and more as emotional betrayal. Morning shows discussed Catherine not as a royal figure, but as a woman navigating illness, motherhood, and pressure with composure. That framing mattered. It reshaped her image from admired figure to protected one. Once that line is crossed, it's almost impossible to reverse. Inside the monarchy, one reality became unavoidable. The future had quietly chosen its center. Catherine didn't seize it. She didn't campaign for it. She simply occupied it by remaining consistent while everything else destabilized. And in doing so, she rendered comparison obsolete. There was no rivalry anymore, only contrast. For Charles, the cost was personal. Balancing loyalty to his wife with responsibility to the crown became an exercise in quiet loss. He did not publicly rebuke Camilla, but neither did he shield her from consequence. Those closest to him described a man aging visibly under the weight of choices that had no clean outcome. History wouldn't record his deliberations, only their results. By the time spring arrived, the emails were rarely mentioned outright, but their impact lingered everywhere. In how schedules were set, in who attended which meetings, in how carefully private thoughts were guarded. The monarchy moved forward, as it always does, but something essential had changed. Innocence, once lost, doesn't return quietly. In the end, the most lasting effect of the leak wasn't damage to reputation. It was clarity. The illusion of harmony had shattered, revealing a family as vulnerable to comparison and resentment as any other. But it also revealed something else. That power in the modern monarchy no longer comes from title alone. It comes from trust, from restraint, and from knowing when silence carries more weight than words, and that is why those emails were truly dangerous. Not because they exposed secrets, but because they revealed fear. And once fear is seen, it can never again pretend to be authority. In the months that followed, something subtle but irreversible settled over the royal family. The crisis was no longer active, no longer dominating headlines, but it had rewired behavior at the highest level. Conversations became shorter. Trust became conditional. Where openness once existed, calculation quietly took its place. The monarchy didn't fracture publicly, but internally, it reorganized around a new understanding. Some lines, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. What made the shift so striking was that Catherine never appeared to capitalize on it. There was no visible power grab, no repositioning, no sudden dominance of the royal calendar. Instead, she became steadier, more consistent, almost immovable. Each appearance reinforced the same image: calm, focused, reliable, and over time. That consistency did something no strategy ever could. It made her indispensable. Camilla, by contrast, seemed to recede without announcement. Her presence remained, but its weight diminished. Where once she had been central to internal discussions, she now appeared informed rather than involved. Observers noted that her public engagements skewed safer, smaller, less symbolic. Projects continued, but momentum stalled. The queen consort still occupied her role, but the energy around it had changed. Authority, once weakened, doesn't disappear overnight. It erodes. Palace insiders later described this period as one of quiet correction. Not punishment, not exile, but recalibration. The institution had learned painfully that emotional leakage posed a greater threat than hostile press ever could. Words written in confidence had nearly destabilized the image of unity the monarchy depended on. From that point forward, discretion was no longer encouraged. It was enforced. The unanswered question of who truly orchestrated the leak never fully went away. Officially, investigations stalled behind jurisdictional walls and legal complexity. Unofficially, most insiders believed the truth would never be revealed publicly, not because it couldn't be uncovered, but because naming a culprit would extend the damage rather than contain it. Sometimes, the monarchy survives not by exposing everything, but by choosing what remains buried. For Catherine, the experience left a mark that wasn't visible but was deeply formative. Those close to her noticed a shift in how she navigated internal relationships. Polite, yes. Warm still. But with clearer boundaries, trust, once freely given, now required time. She had learned the cost of being misunderstood in silence, and she adjusted without bitterness. William's transformation was more pronounced. His tolerance for internal ambiguity vanished entirely. Where he once deferred to tradition, he now demanded safeguards. His leadership style hardened, not in cruelty, but in precision. Protecting Catherine was no longer just personal. It had become institutional. Those around him understood that the future king had drawn a line that would not move again. The public, largely unaware of the internal aftershocks, responded to what it could see. And what it saw was contrast. One figure exposed by private insecurity, another strengthened by restraint. In modern monarchy, perception isn't secondary to power. It is power. And that balance had shifted decisively. By the time the story faded from active conversation, it had already done its work. The emails were no longer discussed, but their lesson remained. Silence is not emptiness. It is control. And in choosing not to speak, Catherine had spoken louder than any statement ever could. The monarchy endured, as it always does, but it emerged, altered, less naive, more guarded, and quietly recentered around the one person who had weathered betrayal without letting it change her public face. In the end, that was the irony Camilla had never anticipated. The very fear she confided in private became the force that confirmed it. What lingered long after the headlines faded was not outrage, but awareness. Within the palace, there was a growing recognition that the monarchy had crossed into a new era, one where internal missteps carried consequences far beyond private hurt. The illusion that senior royals could vent safely, think freely, and speak loosely behind closed doors was gone. Every word now carried weight, not because of fear alone, but because of memory. Everyone had seen how quickly confidence could turn into evidence. For Camilla, this realization was perhaps the most isolating consequence of all. She had spent years mastering the art of public composure, only to discover that the greatest threat came from what she never intended to share. Those closest to her noticed a change. Fewer confidants, fewer unscripted moments. A woman who had once fought relentlessly for acceptance now appeared. Consumed by the knowledge that she had finally been seen too clearly, there was no dramatic fall from grace, no singular moment where everything collapsed. Instead, it was a slow narrowing of space, fewer opportunities to shape narrative, less room to influence tone. The palace had not stripped her of status, but it had quietly removed her margin for error. In an institution that survives on optics, that limitation was profound. Catherine, on the other hand, became something close to immovable. Her presence no longer felt provisional or conditional. It felt settled. Each appearance reinforced the sense that she was not merely part of the monarchy's future, but its anchor. And what made that perception so powerful was that she never acknowledged it. She never leaned into triumph. She never allowed herself to look victorious. She simply remained consistent, and consistency, over time, becomes authority. Observers began noting a shift in how the public spoke about her. No longer just admired, she was trusted. That distinction mattered. Admiration can fade. Trust hardens. It turns support into loyalty. And once loyalty forms, it doesn't need reinforcement. It sustains itself.